Welcome back, class. So we have gone through and discussed several different body systems and organ systems in animals. The last system we're going to discuss is the nervous system in 48 and 49. This is chapter 48 we're starting today, which discusses neurons, synapses, and signaling. So this picture here, this is a cone snail. It looks relatively harmless, right? Most snails you've encountered are probably just relatively harmless. But this guy actually is a major hunter. So he has a nervous system that is able to take signals around him or it and process that information to detect when another animal is nearby, whether that's a fish or a scuba diver. And if there is another organism around it, this little tooth-like structure here acts a little bit like a harpoon, and it can inject a neurotoxin. That neurotoxin gets into what animal has been injected and can pretty quickly, pretty instantly kill an animal. So what it does is, as a neurotoxin, it acts on the nervous system of what animal has just been injected, and it will shut down the ability of your nervous cells to connect and speak to each other. So you're no longer able to control the actions of your body. So you will either be paralyzed or you could be killed. And as scary as that is, we've actually been able to take some of these cone snails and use this neurotoxin to create a lot of pretty good medicines. So some non-opioid pain relief, so it can stop the pain signals from getting to your body. It can be used sometimes in surgery as a way to calm a patient's nervous system while they are on the operating table. So initially harmless looking, actually can be quite dangerous, and actually can be a little helpful, all through modulating your nervous system. So your nervous system is going to depend on neurons to send, receive, and interpret information from the world around it. That little cone snail we were just looking at, it had to be able to receive a signal so it could sense there was another animal around it, then send that signal and interpret that information into a signal that says, now it's time to, shoot out my little neurotoxin. You right now are listening to what I'm saying. So your ears are picking up the sound waves, and your neurons are taking that in, receiving that information, sending it to your brain, and your brain is then interpreting that information. This involves long distance transmission. So if you step on something, if you step on a sharp tack, you have to send that signal all the way from your toe all the way to your brain. But it makes it up to your brain in a short amount of time, right? So almost instantly, you've stepped on it, and, you scream, you pull out the tack, you take care of your toe. It doesn't take a couple of days before that signal gets to your brain, before you realize, oh, hey, I have a tack stuck in my toe. You instantly, short amount of time, this long distance signal has been sent, which is pretty remarkable, actually. Neurons are going to be able to send electrical signals. They're going to conduct electrical signals. And when they're sending these signals, they're all going to send the exact same kind of electrical signal. So the way your brain receives these messages isn't what signal is being sent, it's what connection was used, what cell sent that signal. So interpreting that this is a pain response, or this is a cold breeze, or you're hearing something or smelling something that smells good, all of these signals are sending the same signal, the same type of signaling molecules, but they're received by your brain as different signals because of those different neural pathways. All of this interpretation in complex animals like us is going to occur in your brain, and the neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system that are called ganglia. In less complex animals, we've talked about some of their more primitive nervous systems that they have, and they're still able to receive some sensory information and respond to it. So the nervous system is able to control and regulate and coordinate how you respond to stimuli. It also is working along with hormones, although hormones are more sending different types of signals and more slow acting. Your nervous system is able to help you respond to your internal and external environment. A stimulus being any internal or external environmental change that elicits a response by an organism. That could be a bright light that triggers your pupils to constrict. It could be a hot iron that makes you yelp and pull your hand off the oven. A beautiful sound of music that makes you just stop and enjoy it. And within your nervous system, there are two types of cells, neurons and glial cells. That seems like a pretty good question to show up on a quiz or exam. What are your two types of nervous cells? And what do each of those cells do? That's what we're going to spend a lot of this lecture talking about. Within a neuron, here is one neuron, and here's another neuron. So we have two cells here. They both have a cell body. That's kind of this big circular middle part that kind of acts with all of the functions that you think of a typical cell that we've talked about this past couple of semesters. It's got organelles, it's got a nucleus, it's got cytoplasm inside of it. It's just a nice cell, just your general cell features. It's got dendrites all around it. So dendrites mean tree. Can you see kind of why these dendrites would be named after a tree? They kind of have that morphology or that shape reminiscent of tree branches or tree roots. Dendrites are going to branch off of the cell body, and they can connect to other neurons, and they can receive signals. So here, this neuron is sending a signal, and it can be received by these dendrites. Then there is one long axon here. And that axon has this area here called an axon hillock. So here's the axon hillock for this cell. Can you find the axon hillock for the other cell? So it would be right here where it connects to the axon. The axon hillock is going to be where an electrical signal is made. And then the signal travels down the axon. The axon is kind of just this long transmitting cord that sends it to this cell. So these dendrites receive a signal, pass it on through the axon. These dendrites then receive the signal, pass it through the cell. The axon hillock forms an electrical signal, passes it on. A synapse is where two of these cells come together. So if you are right here on this image and pull in here, this is a synapse. So this cell is a presynaptic cell. It's where this signal came from before the synapse. And this is a postsynaptic cell, where the signal goes after the signal is sent. So at this synapse, these two cells are able to come together. This cell that's sending a signal is sending these little neurotransmitters to this other cell. So these little neurotransmitters are the little signals that this cell is able to pick up as a message to tell it that it needs to respond to. Chemical signals here that are used by the cells to signal, these are called neurotransmitters. They go from one cell to another across the synapse. The signal comes from the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell. So presynaptic cells could be thought of as the sender, and postsynaptic cells could be thought of as the receiver. There are two types of cells in our neural tissue. Neurons, which transmit and interpret signals. So all of these things we were just talking about doing, those are our neurons. The other type of cell are glial cells. And glial cells help neurons. They help neurons do whatever they need to do. They might clean, nourish, insulate, or protect the neurons. And they might produce CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. Here's a little picture of a dendrite, of a neuron. And again, it's called dendrite because of what? Do you remember? It's called a dendrite because it looks like a tree. Look at how beautiful that is. Can you find the cell body on that cell? Can you find the start of the axon? Even though it doesn't show the entire axon, you can see where it starts. Okay, in your nervous system, there are 3 integrated functions that help integrate information processing. One is a sensory input. So if we go back to our cone snail, the sensory input is it can tell there's a change in the light or a change in movement of the water around it. Somehow it receives a signal that there is a fish around it. So the sensory input is the receiving sensory information. You feel something, you hear something, you smell something, you touch something. Then integration. Integration is those neural circuits in your nervous system process that information. They're able to say, okay, the water's moving, the light has changed, I can tell there's a fish there. And then it determines what needs to be done. Whether it is, this is a signal I can ignore, or this is a signal I need to send my little neurotoxin out. And then the motor output, when the cone snail ejects its little toxin out. Our nervous system is divided into 2 parts, your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. That again looks like a very easy to write quiz question, doesn't it? What are the 2 divisions of the nervous system? What is the function of the central nervous system? What is the function of the peripheral nervous system? So your 2 divisions are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, this is going to be your brain and your spinal cord. These are really responsible for integrating actions. So your brain is not going to be doing the seeing or the hearing or the touching. It's going to be integrating the signals. Then the peripheral nervous system, which is the neurons, are going to receive the information, carry them to your central nervous system, and then after your central nervous system has integrated and decided what needs to be happening, the neurons are going to take that message from the central nervous system. Then when axons of neurons are bundled together, they will create nerves. We are going to end with this little BioFlix video showing you how synapses work. This video is both going to summarize what we just talked about, but also introduce what we'll be talking about in the next lecture video, where we talk about what those neurotransmitters are and how they are sent from cells, how your cells create them, and how those messages work in your body.
Our brains are constantly processing information, which requires communication between billions of nerve cells. Signals are passed from a sending neuron to a receiving neuron at a junction called a synapse. An action potential in the sending neuron travels down the axon until it reaches a synaptic terminal. The narrow gap between the synaptic terminal and the receiving neuron is called the synaptic cleft. The synaptic terminal of a sending neuron contains numerous vesicles filled with neurotransmitters, chemicals that carry information across the synaptic cleft. When an action potential reaches the synaptic terminal, the vesicles fuse with the plasma membrane of the sending neuron, releasing neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters affect the receiving neuron, changing the distribution of charge across its membrane. Let's take a closer look. An action potential is propagated down an axon by the opening and closing of sodium and potassium channels. When an action potential arrives at the synaptic terminal, it causes the opening of calcium channels, shown in green. Calcium ions enter the synaptic terminal through the calcium channels. Calcium ions bind to the vesicles containing neurotransmitters. This causes the vesicles to fuse with the plasma membrane of the sending neuron, releasing neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to receptors in the plasma membrane of the receiving neuron. Here, the receptors are ion channels that open. Ions move across the membrane, changing the distribution of charge across the membrane. The neurotransmitters are quickly removed from the synaptic cleft, ending their effect on the receiving neuron. A single neuron can receive signals from many sending neurons. The signals arriving from the axon on the left are excitatory. They make the receiving neuron more likely to generate an action potential, as indicated by the green glows. Signals from the axon on the right are inhibitory. They make the receiving neuron less likely to generate an action potential, as indicated by the red glows. The two sets of signals cancel each other out, and no action potential is generated. Now, only excitatory signals are transmitted, and the receiving neuron generates an action potential down its axon. The signals that pass between these and countless other neurons constitute our thoughts and coordinate our activities.
Okay, so that's the end of our first part of this chapter. Please come back for the second part of chapter 48, where we'll start discussing action potentials and ions and how all of that works in your nervous system. See you later. Bye.